nuclear program, George Washington University hosted regional experts for discussion Monday. Speakers included a former Iranian presidential candidate and a former official at the American Embassy in Iran. This is about 2 hours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to talk on the possibility of having a normal, peaceful relationship with Iran. And it seems to me, and I'll declare my opinion at the outset, that this is the best chance that we've had since the revolution. It's 34 years now. And that we should make every effort to see if it can work. And I'll go through what that effort would entail. First is the nuclear question. Does Iran have any nuclear weapons? The answer from all intelligence sources and from the IAEA and from the expert community is that it has no nuclear weapons. Does it have the capacity to build nuclear weapons? And the answer is yes, it does have the capacity. And that's the dilemma. Having the capacity, can you trust monitoring and verification sufficiently to be able to take remedial action if the peaceful path is abandoned and Iran goes down the path to acquiring its own nuclear weapons? That's the task of that was set before all nations in the NPT, and all the signatories to the NPT are devoted to that task to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons and to encourage those nations that have nuclear weapons to reduce their stocks, hopefully to zero. And certainly the United States and Russia and the states of the former Soviet Union have taken to heart the effort to reduce their weapons stocks. There are far too many in the world, and other nations have acquired nuclear weapons in the recent past. Israel, Pakistan, India. In a volatile Middle East. Is there any belief, is there any reason to believe that Iran would follow a peaceful path for the foreseeable future? There's quite a bit of evidence that that will be the case, starting with the joining of Iran to the NPT shortly after the formation of the non-proliferation treaty regime under the Shah, continuation under the revolutionary government. Initially, there were questions about the use of weapons of mass destruction, which covered beyond nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, poison gas, biological weapons, that is the use of natural and unnatural toxins. Iran was faced with a dilemma in the first years of the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam Hussein, supported by many countries in the West, and including my own, used chemical weapons, poison gas, against the Iranian forces. There were many casualties, tens of thousands, many of whom are suffering today, those that survived the attacks. The question was raised by the Iranian military with the Ayatollah Khomeini: should we retaliate in kind? May we have the authority to do so? They're killing us, and we have to retaliate. Khomeini answered very directly, giving an order that chemical weapons could not be used. Weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, nuclear and biological, were forbidden by Islam. This was the first of 8 fatwas that have been issued in the Iranian context. So that very early on, a context was established where Iran would have no weapons of mass destruction, relying upon its conventional forces for defense of the realm, and where it was able to work out a stalemate with the invading forces from Iraq under Saddam Hussein after 8 years of disastrous, costly in treasure and in lives, war. So the record from the outset has been against the use of weapons of mass destruction. However, there's the capability, and I know a little bit about the capability, and I've studied it for much of my adult life. It happens that when I was assigned to Iran as a junior diplomat in 1959, one of my first tasks was to accompany David Lilienthal, the former head of the Atomic Energy Commission, on his trip around Iran. He was in retirement. He was head of a energy company that worked with the Plan Organization of Iran on its energy needs for the coming centuries. And he developed a plan of hydro, gas-fired, coal-fired, and nuclear power plants that would supply the energy needs of Iran. And that original plan had a proposal of 22 reactors, nuclear reactors, 2 for each Ostan. And of course, that was a grand plan, not feasible in the immediate circumstances, but certainly over the long term. It was a part of the vision of the United States government of Atoms for Peace, where we fostered the development of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, including mining, diversion of rivers, and of course power plants for the production of energy and the desalination of seawater for agricultural purposes. Lilienthal's argument, as I recall it, was that Iran should use its oil and gas resources not for its own energy, but for sale abroad, export, that they should develop their own infrastructure from the proceeds from the sale of oil and gas, and use the valued resources which were finite in nature to develop a sound infrastructure of energy production. So that was the American vision in 1960. Of course, the world learned of the dangers of nuclear power plants, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and I know quite a bit about Chernobyl, having served quite near there, and have seen the effects of runaway reactors and the dangers inherent and the costs, the long-term costs. And of course we've learned too. Our nuclear programs have been cut back, and we're looking desperately for safe nuclear reactors and new technologies that will make the vision of the 50s and the 60s a reality. I dwell on this because the Shah embraced this, and the present revolutionary government has embraced this as well. And we're the authors. We're the authors in many ways. Most of the nuclear scientists in Iran, both physicists and engineers, chemists, people who put things together, build power plants, were educated and trained in the West, particularly in the United States. And that's the case now. Ali Akbar Salehi, who was presently once again head of the atomic energy program for Iran, is an MIT graduate, PhD, and his subject is the physics of nuclear power plants. The present leadership under President Rouhani is very familiar with the issues that I've just related, and including the detailed knowledge of the programs that Iran has embarked on over the 50 years that they have pursued nuclear energy research and development. And their position, their declaratory position, is that we have no interest in nuclear weapons, although we are surrounded by nuclear weapons, although we can build nuclear weapons, but we can only build a few. And if we built them strategically, we would become even more vulnerable as a target for retaliation. So this is the declaratory policy, this is the strategic policy, and this is buttressed by an ethical and religious view that many Iranians hold, that the use of weapons of mass destruction is forbidden by the teachings of Islam. And I would hasten to add that the three great monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, all hold the same position on the use of force indiscriminately against innocent civilians. So this is the background. And what is the reality that we face now? We have a government that has come to power by election, by popular election, that is seasoned. They have been involved in negotiations on the nuclear question and negotiations with the United States before. In fact, for much of their adult life. They're very good, and I can say that having spent the last month in New York, meeting with them, listening to them, and watching the reaction of our government to their behavior and proposals. They're very good. They're as good diplomats as you will find anywhere in the world, and I say that as a person who has been involved in diplomacy all of my life. They're very good. And they know what they're talking about. And it seems to me that for the first time in 34 years, we have a congruence of national leadership in Iran, popularly elected, supported by the supreme leader, experienced, and that we should make every effort to test the proposition of whether we can come to terms with them. The terms are very clear. No nuclear weapons, the ability to monitor all of the peaceful activities of Iran with full transparency and access, particularly through the IAEA, the monitoring arm of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm very optimistic that there's a chance of success, but it will require an active will on the part of our leadership and their leadership. And the testing ground began in New York last month. It was continued in Geneva and will be continued in 10 days or so, again in Geneva and throughout the coming year. I think they could reach agreement very quickly on technical grounds, particularly. Gaining national approval is a much harder task. We know what the strength of our lobbies are. We know what past attitudes have been. The sting of humiliation that took place when the hostages were taken remains in our psyche, our national psyche. And we have much political work to do. When I say we, it's we the people, but it's mainly the task of the Obama administration to make the case to Congress that has to agree in large measure. A similar case pertains in Iran. Whether the great Satan can be removed as a boogeyman is a pertinent question. We'll see. We'll see. And I'm one of those who believes that not only are agreements possible, but I think that our president and the leaders of our country are wise enough and experienced enough to seize the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Miller. Our next speaker to answer the question is going to be Dr. Patrick Clausen from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Please welcome him.
Thanks. Ambassador Miller spoke eloquently about reasons for some optimism that the nuclear impasse can be resolved, and I hope he's quite correct. But what I thought I would do is discuss a different topic, and that is some of the barriers that may remain to a close working relationship between the Iranian and American governments in the event that there is a nuclear agreement. And it's useful for us to recall that there are a wide range of other issues on which the two governments differ. And to take one very obvious example, the United States government has now, for some 30 years, listed the Iranian government as the leading state supporter of terrorism in the world. I've testified now in some 30 federal court cases as an expert witness about, these are court cases brought by the victims of Iranian-sponsored terrorism or by their heirs. And I remember that one of the early cases, the judge asked me, well, excuse me, Mr. Clausen, but what evidence do you have that Iran supports Hezbollah? And I said, well, Hezbollah says that Iran supports them. Iran says that Iran supports them. The U.S. government says Iran supports them. The government of Lebanon says Iran supports them. The judge said, it seems pretty not a difficult thing to testify about. I cannot see the Iranian government breaking off its relationship with Hezbollah. And given Hezbollah's activities these days in Syria, Nasrallah gave one of his speeches today, it's quite eloquent, I cannot see the United States government, for that matter the European government, taking Hezbollah off a list of terrorism organizations. And this is going to be a barrier. It's going to be a barrier. For instance, quite a number of the sanctions that the United States has placed on Iran are listed as being either because of Iran's support of terrorism or for a variety of reasons. The nuclear impasse, Iran's support of terrorism, human rights reasons, and it's going to be quite difficult to disentangle all that. This is a real problem that we have. And then we also have the problem that not only do we know relatively little about Iran, but frankly, Iranian leaders know relatively little about us. Rouhani and his team are, in many ways, the last remnants of the generations that knew the United States very well and were trained in the United States. And there's a large group of leadership, disturbingly including many of the younger leaders, who do not have that kind of close and intimate contact with the outside world at all, much less with the West, and much less with the United States. And this is a problem, is that their lack of experience leads them to take some rather remarkable positions and to misunderstand debates in Washington and to misunderstand U.S. politics. So I frankly think that there are a lot of barriers to having close relationships between the two governments. But what about correct relations? I mean, almost all during the years of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had correct relations. Not good relations, but correct relations. And that kind of correct relations can be very useful for diffusing tensions, and also for allowing people-to-people contact, even if the governments disagree. And so let us ask, what is the possibility that we can achieve at least that level of rapprochement where we could have some easier people-to-people contact with Iran? Well, I hope I'm wrong, but I have to tell you that I am a pessimist because of the attitude of Iran's supreme leader and many of those who support him. The supreme leader is famously has said that negotiations between the United States and Iran are like negotiations between the lamb and the wolf. Not an encouraging analogy. But here I'm not referring to his suspicions about the United States government as I am referring to his attitude that the gravest danger to the Islamic Republic is cultural invasion from the West. This has been one of the most important themes of his 20 years, the last 20 years that he's in office. And he has warned that the cultural invasion from the West perverts Iranian life and especially religious sensibilities. There's a very nice little brochure out, or monograph out, from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace by Karim Sajidpour, called Reading Khomeini, which has lots of examples from this viewpoint of Khomeini. One of my favorites is a theme that he has come back to several times, is explaining that miniskirts are much more dangerous to Iran's national security than tanks, because miniskirts can confuse the young soldiers who will then not be able to fight, and that this is the greatest danger that the Islamic Republic faces. And furthermore, his view about the risks of cultural invasion is added to this is his concern about what is often called a soft overthrow, a velvet revolution, in reference to the events of the former Czechoslovakia. And Khomeini's favorite expression for this is post-modern imperialism, where he says that what the great powers do these days is they don't seek to, usually, to invade and rule another country, but they seek to overthrow its governments by promoting people-to-people contact, non-governmental organizations, and use of radio, satellite television, and the like. And so his vision of what threatens Iran was well captured by that moment of Michelle Obama presenting the Academy Award for Argo this last year, in that his vision is cultural invasion of Western ideas, which he thinks is organized and supported by the United States government. And he is firmly convinced that what Hollywood does is something that is closely worked out with Washington. Not all of us in Washington see those kind of relationships, but a few years ago, the Iranian government imprisoned the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Middle East program, Hala Esfandiari, when she went to Iran to visit her ailing mother well up in her 80s. And Hala is a very respected person who's done a great deal to try and promote better U.S.-Iranian relations, and there were many around the world, there were some 22 governments that asked the Iranian government to release her, and under some pressure to explain why they were still holding her, the Iranian state television put on a program in which they explained that she was part of this Velvet Revolution plan, and they had as a illustration of how this plan proceeds, they showed in animated form these 4 Iranian agents who were receiving their instructions from the weekly meeting that George Bush was having with George Soros in the White House to discuss how to promote revolution in Iran. Not all of us knew that Mr. Soros and Mr. Bush were so close in these matters, right? As I said, there are some in Iran whose knowledge, I mean, Paulette tells me that it was really very difficult to have to explain to these young people who were interrogating her how Washington works. They just didn't have a clue, But this attitude on the part of the supreme leader is what makes him so suspicious of people-to-people contact. Right? And why he thinks that people-to-people contact, which we see as a normal thing, governments may differ, people may have political differences, but surely we can have ordinary people-to-people contact. Well, as far as the supreme leader is concerned, his great concern is that this leads to cultural invasion, and that this is organized at the level of the U.S. government in order to promote government revolution. So I hope we can overcome that. I certainly would say that almost all of Mr. Rouhani's new appointments are people who don't have much time for this viewpoint, because they understand that while certainly the United States government does send spies to Iran, I hate to tell you that, but if we're spending $30 billion or more for an intelligence agency that doesn't send spies to Iran, something's wrong. But that these people in the Rouhani government understand that there are more benefits to Iran from its contact with the outside world, and they're not going to do these kind of silly things of telling university professors that it's suspicious when a foreign professor writes you an email. So I would hope that we can get to have more people-to-people contacts with this new crowd, but I just know that there are certainly some in Iran who are opposed to it. The U.S. government is also, shall we say, cumbersome, slow, and suspicious, and that this can create a great many barriers to normal commerce and to normal people-to-people relations. And our bureaucracies can be impressively bad about dealing with these situations, but we also face real quandaries. I mean, we've got a very nice study that I'm trying to shepherd to publications by alumnus of this university about Iranian students here in the United States and identifying the problems they face. And you know, the deep, dark secret of this, the polling that we have done of Iranian students in the United States is that 92% of them want to stay. Well, it may be very worthwhile to bring Iranian students here to the United States, but let's be honest, this is more an immigration policy than primarily a people-to-people exchange. And so we have some reasons for our suspicions, but even when we don't have reasons for our suspicions, we tend to act very slowly. And so in particular, because of the mutual suspicions between Iran and the United States, I think that any progress towards rapprochement is likely to come at a labored pace. So I'm an optimist in life, and I hope that much can happen, both on the nuclear impasse and on these people-to-people talks. But folks, we're pushing a very heavy rock up a very steep hill.
Thank you, Dr. Clausen. Our third speaker will be Dr. Houshang Amirahmadi, Rutgers University professor and founder and president of the American Iranian Council.
First, welcome and good afternoon. I wanted first to take this opportunity to thank Manuela, U.S Vaus and Kayvan. And John, Manuela, and Kayvan really are the people who have done this. And I'm very honored to say, and AIC is very fortunate to have these young visionaries, behind its activities. And as we move forward, I'm hoping at one point that they take the leadership of organizations like AIC, and I'm sure they will.
The microphone, please.
Is that? You don't hear that?
Shout.
It's been loud? Okay, shout. Okay, I'm actually good at shouting. I'm sorry, I just was saying that I'm very honored to have this young people, Kayvan, John, and Manuela behind this work, and that these are visionary young people that hopefully at the near future there will be a leading organization like AIC, and as we move in the forward with U.S. Iran relations. After years of non-communication or miscommunication, the United States and Iran are in direct dialogue over Iran's nuclear program, of course, at this point. This is a great beginning, and we know what has already happened or what has been achieved so far. But the question is, will the engagement lead to a settlement? That's the real question. Will this engagement lead to a settlement? There are the idealists who see the deal all but done. The deficitists who see no chance for a breakthrough. And the realists who see the development as a historic opportunity that is constrained by serious challenges on both sides. More significantly, there are the supporters and the detractors. While the latter remain dominant in both sides, they are increasingly becoming defensive given their lack of a better alternative to a diplomatic solution to this protracted conflict. The fact is, more Western sanctions and threat of force have resulted in more Iranian centrifuges and enriched uranium at progressively higher grades. The detractors have indeed deserved themselves by standing against diplomacy. True, sanctions have made Iran offer the 5+1 group of nations a more reasonable deal than in the past. But continuation of the existing sanctions or adding more to them will not make Iran capitulate more. Serious nations have red lines. On the contrary, more sanctions will surely make Iran continue on the current nuclear path, resulting more likely than not to an American military attack and or an Iranian nuclear bomb. For over 2 decades, I have consistently been on the side of the realists and the supporters, knowing well that for traversing the bumpy road, Washington and Tehran needed as much realism and support as possible. Indeed, I never wavered in my belief that one day, sooner or later, the two governments would arrive at a mutually beneficial destination. That time might have come. That time might have come, and we must be more than ever before prepared to support the current engagement with a sense of course, realism. Evidence suggests that both governments see it in their best interests to settle the nuclear dispute at the intersection of Iran's rights to peaceful nuclear technology and America's requirement that Iran never build a nuclear bomb. More significantly, after years of mutual mistrust, the two sides seem to think that a verifiable deal is possible and within reach. They are not wrong in this assessment. While the details remain confidential, from the media leaks, we know the key parameters of the emerging deal. Iran is expected to significantly slow the pace, narrow the scope, limit the amount and reduce the grade level of its nuclear enrichment. The country is also expected to allow access and intrusive inspections of its nuclear sites by accepting the IAEA's additional protocol. While Iran may not be left, given this deal, with a practical nuclear program, it can nevertheless claim to have gained its quote-unquote inalienable nuclear rights. In return for such a symbolic end state for Iran's nuclear program, President Rouhani expects to receive, and indeed must receive, significant, if not total, relief from crippling multilateral and unilateral sanctions, as otherwise he would not be able to deliver the deal. This is where I believe the challenge lies. How will the two sides reciprocate relieving sanctions for limiting enrichments? Logically, they should be able to devise an incremental approach of give and take. Practically, however, the approach requires a level of mutual trust and confidence that, unfortunately, they still lack. Complicating the situation is the pressure from the detractors. In Iran, the fundamentalists want President Rouhani to first take and then give. That is, sanctions relief to precede enrichment limits. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the hawks want President Obama to first take and then give. That is, enrichment limits to precede sanction relief, I'm sorry. And there are, of course, the hawkish detractors beyond the two countries who do not want a give and take deal to begin with. They want to take it all. Can the two governments overcome the challenges of mistrust and devise a fair incremental procedure? While President Rouhani currently has support from the Supreme Leader, who does not have trust in the U.S. to begin with, that backing remains conditional on him, that is President Rouhani, being able to significantly reduce sanctions and free Iranian frozen assets. Notwithstanding the Supreme Leader's support, Rouhani's nascent government faces a serious challenge from its conservative religious rivals, who lost the election but remain strong. They are not dead, my friends. The conservatives do not trust the U.S., view it as weak, and do not think that Iran needs to make serious compromises to settle the nuclear dispute. They consistently remind President Rouhani of American economic problems and its difficulties in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Egypt, among other nations. At the same time, they choose to ignore their own problems. President Rouhani's rivals are already accusing him of being, quote-unquote, naive and oblivious to the American, quote-unquote, dishonest game. They also see the secrecy surrounding the negotiation as a conspiracy against their Islamic system. Yet, the main problem President Rouhani faces is time. To maintain the leader's support and keep the rivals at bay, he must reach a reasonable deal with the U.S. and reduce sanctions significantly, all within a quick amount of time. There is another reason for President Rouhani's often trumpeted desire to settle the nuclear dispute within the shortest possible time, and that is the next Iranian parliamentary elections in this coming February. Not February 2015, I mean to say. Unless President Rouhani demonstrates result, he could lose public support, and his rivals would use the opportunity to gain even more seats in the parliament and then use it to cripple its administration. Therefore, by opening to the U.S., President Rouhani has taken a serious risk, making himself vulnerable to the American whims and the vagaries of his domestic opponents. No wonder that he seriously wants to make compromise as much and as fast as possible and gain a proportionate concession on sanctions. Thus, unless President Obama, and here is the case, unless President Obama is willing and able to help, President Rouhani would have a short honeymoon, and the chance for a breakthrough with the Islamic Republic will be lost. But the challenges President Obama faces are no less serious, though they are more manageable. While many of the sanctions are written in law and are controlled by the Congress, they also give the President maximum leeway, the power to waive. But to use the power to waive or to waive, the White House must in writing certify that the full enforcement of the law will harm American national interest. It has to be in writing. The State Department has used the waiver to allow a few countries, 8 countries I believe, to continue buying Iranian crude oil at a much reduced level. But will President Obama use the waiver more boldly? I doubt it he will. Obama has been a risk-averse president when it comes to complicated international matters. He also has many fights to settle with the Congress and will not want to add Iran to his fighting basket. But President Obama has also a stake in seeing the Iranian nuclear conflict resolved through a reasonable deal. He could make history, legacy issue, and help his party, the Democratic Party, win the next presidential election. If the Iranian nuclear deal goes, Hillary Clinton will be our next president. These conflicting tendencies between risk averting and legacy making is at the heart of President Obama's vagueness, double talks, and indecisiveness on opening to Iran. While Obama may not wish to challenge the hawkish members of the Congress, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Republican Party, he sure wishes to strengthen President Rouhani's hands in dealing with his conservative rivals during the negotiation. To that end, the administration has been flirting with the idea of unfreezing Iranian assets and allowing Iran to purchase spare parts for its aging planes. This approach will serve the risk-averse and hesitant president who does not wish to trust the untrusted Mr. Rouhani. While these half measures somewhat could help Mr. Rouhani in the start, Obama's lack of courage and clarity will ultimately hurt the Iranian president. In sum, a historic window of opportunity has opened in U.S. Iran relations, and there is a real chance that a reasonable deal could be reached to the Iranian nuclear program. However, many forces remain to be convinced and many obstacles to be removed. If the bumpy road is to be traversed to a mutually beneficial destination, the time has come for the conflicting parties to listen to the voice of reason and give peace a chance by putting aside their maximum demands and work cooperatively and courageously in the best interests of all involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amir Ahmadi. Our last speaker before moving on to the panel discussion section will be Dr. Andrew Parasiliti. He is the president and CEO of AlMonitor.com. Please welcome him.
Can I speak from here? Hi, and excuse me, I'm going to sit while speaking. And with regard to the question, is this an opportunity or is this all cosmetic? I think I come down on the side that this is an opportunity. And the first group of remarks I'll make is, I think always when you analyze, good policy follows good analysis. And I think it helps to know what we know and what we don't know about Iran and be clear as we proceed forward. And Ambassador Miller said this succinctly. I'll be a little less succinct, but I think it's worth bearing down a little because we live in an age where we're driven by opinion and taking a stand, and many times in the media world people say things that are assumptions and they aren't necessarily fact. So it's a good idea, especially as we're at George Washington University, to push ourselves on this pedagogy. And this may seem basic, but I think it's also fundamental. On Iran's nuclear program, it is worth recalling the collective wisdom of the U.S. intelligence community about Iran's nuclear calculations per the testimony of James Clapper, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence on March 12, 2013. And I'm quoting him. "We assess Iran is developing nuclear capabilities to enhance its security, prestige, and regional influence, and give it the ability to develop nuclear weapons should a decision be made to do so. We do not know if Iran will eventually decide to build nuclear weapons." The collective wisdom of our national intelligence community, and I'm not saying that's gospel, but it's important, we don't know if they're developing nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not a nuclear specialist, you know, I try to talk to people and read things that are authoritative, and those of you who want to follow this and know what we all know, you should read the quarterly reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors. You can get them online, the reports on the Iranian program. And there are many questions about the program that Iran has been asked to address and which they have not addressed to this point. And this is at the core of the negotiations. The report, however, does not say that Iran has a nuclear weapons capability, but they raise many questions about the direction of the program. So this is what we know about what we don't know. Now, again, being at a university, and I'm not always in an academic context, I did go to school down the road at SAIS a while back, but I'll take the advantage here to say many people again, make certain assumptions about Iran's intentions in negotiations, but I'd make the case here, to use a political science term, that we're dealing with a rational actor situation. Iran is making a choice, has a choice before it. And this seems supported by recent events. On the one hand, why would Iran pursue a nuclear weapon? Well, look at the region it lives in. It's got a nuclear power, Pakistan, on its border, with which they have not had fantastic relations over the years. A hostile relationship with Saudi Arabia, with whom it's fighting a proxy war in Syria. A 3-decade hostile relationship with the United States, which has led an international effort at sanctions, which has wrecked the Iranian economy, and for which Iran needs relief. And this is a key motivation, I think, for the latest diplomatic flurry by Tehran. And in the broadest strategic context, a concern about Israel, which itself considers an Iranian nuclear weapon an existential threat. Those might be incentives to pursue a nuclear weapon. Or perhaps it might not pursue a nuclear weapon if there are incentives at lifting the economic siege, providing economic reliefs to its people, and some assurances of a reduction in regional security, which may be the motivations for the program in the first place. So I come back again, when we think about Iran, to a choice and a broader analytical appeal, with all due respect to Iranian culture and history, and we should be informed by that, and the ideology of the revolution and the government there, which should not be dismissed. But from a process point, an American diplomatic point, there is every reason to test these propositions in a rational way and not dismiss them. Iran is weighing its choices, and that assessment by DNI Clapper was before the election of Hassan Rouhani, which could be, I think, fairly interpreted as a call for change, and before the diplomatic blitz by him and his foreign minister, and in a new approach, a more open and constructive approach that has been recognized by all of the P5+1 partners. So in terms of whether it's cosmetic or it's real, in terms of the diplomatic process that's before us, I don't know how it plays out, but the process, yeah, it's real, because not seeing it is denying the hand in front of your face, because this is what's happening before our eyes. Now, there was a comment about some constraints we might deal with, and I'll touch on that one briefly. But let me tell you another one, and all my colleagues mentioned it briefly. The issue of time is really critical here, and I'm not going to get into the Congress or what's happening in Iran, because others have addressed that and said the things I would otherwise say. But these types of think about the context of negotiations with Iran. 30 years of a hostile relationship. And think of the time pressures in that context that we put on a meeting that takes place how soon after Rouhani came to office? How soon after the first serious proposal or discussions in early October in Geneva? Think of that context. Now, the constraints are real here in the United States and there in Iran from varying interests. But that is a loaded relationship with a lot of bad blood, as we would say, in terms of, you go back to the bombing of our Marine barracks in Lebanon by Hezbollah, the shooting down of the Iranian Airbus in 1989 or 88 by the U.S. naval vessel, the Vincennes, and we could go on and on about what's happened. This is a hostile, bitter relationship. And the diplomatic trend, which I think is real, is very fragile. And to put things in context, I just went through and did a list. So we're talking about how fast we got to move. The U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Negotiations began in May 2004. It went into effect May 2012. Two friendly countries both having an interest in it. There are domestic politics and all that stuff, as this always happens, right? U.S.-Korea free trade. The first round, February 2006. There were renegotiations. It went into effect March 2012. the New START Treaty. Formal negotiations began in 2009. This was a fast one. This ended in February 2011. Put this in context. Those are countries that we have established relationships and diplomatic channels and all these things. And look at how it took, and then look at the time constraints we're dealing with Iran. It's very tricky, very difficult, and I think the details have all been laid out well. You know, it'll monitor what we try to do, and those of you who don't know us, check us out, elmonitor.com, is what we try to do is identify trends in the region, and the way we get at trends is we try to have the best reporters and analysts there, writing in their languages, which we translate, and then it goes up, and that's how I learn a lot of stuff. And one of the trends we've looked at, and again, this is related to Iran, is the U.S.-Russia cooperation on the CW destruction in Syria. We're not talking about U.S.-Russia relations here, but everything's kind of related when it comes to the region. I'll get into the Syria piece in just a minute. I can personally consider that a landmark agreement. And it's also the issue of chemical weapons has been an area where there's some kind of potential understanding with Iran. In April, we picked up a quote that didn't get a lot of play, where the former Iranian foreign minister referred to the use of chemical weapons in Syria as a red line. He used Obama's own words. The UN Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeff Feltman, the highest-ranking American at the United Nations, and a former Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and Ambassador to Lebanon, was in Iran in August, talking with them prior to the U.S.-Russia deal as things were being worked out. These things were being discussed. And I interviewed Foreign Minister Zarif when he was in New York, and basically the headline is, he said, look, we have this history of use of chemical weapons, and we've destroyed chemical weapons. We can help in this process, and they supported this process all along. In fact, an Iranian deputy foreign minister was in Moscow when the agreement was announced. An interesting coincidence. And they've been willing to help and been involved in this process. While we're on the subject of Syria, and let's think about Syria for a minute. You know, one of our writers who's based here in Washington, Jeffrey Aronson, said something fascinating about Syria in a recent article. He said, Syria is the arena where the basic prerequisites for progress on the U.S. Iran agenda, recognizing core interests and fashioning mechanisms to safeguard them, are being forged in word and in deed. So let's look at Syria. No question that Iran is the #1 backer of the Syrian government, of Bashar al-Assad, as is Hezbollah, and that support has been critical to the success the regime has had, being backed forced. So that's a key part of it, and that's why Iran is essential to the diplomatic process, because there's no diplomacy or any type of end to the war in Syria unless you deal with Iran. You know, we reported at Al Monitor on May 24 in an interview with Iran's UN ambassador Mohammad Karzai. Iran welcomed the Geneva II initiative, which is the U.S.-Russia UN agreement to try to pursue a peace conference on Syria. They welcomed it as early as May. And if you look at, again, I come back to Jeff Feltman, what he said in October, he said, it's hard for me to imagine a solution in Syria that works if Iran isn't somehow engaged and involved in this in one form or another. We are focused on how you would implement the Geneva Action Plan from last year, so we would want to make sure that whoever accepts the invitation to participate understand that they are there to show support for a political solution based on the Geneva Communique. So whether they are the regional, international, or Syrian parties, they need to make sure they are there to implement Geneva. So should we be engaged with Iran or not? Yes, I think we should be engaged with Iran. Now, I don't know if Iran's going to accept the Geneva Communique, but they've certainly offered to help play a role in Geneva if they're invited. So again, Iran, key there. My colleague, Dr. Clausen, mentioned Hezbollah, and I think and talked about the complexities of the sanctions issue and how that all plays. I think this is, you can't talk about Syria without talking about Hezbollah, and it makes the broader point that Iran's role in this region is absolutely critical to all this key strategic issues in play. Hezbollah is on Israel's border. We've also been following with our correspondents in Gaza how Hamas's troubled relationship with Iran. Iran can play and does play a role there. Any negotiation that leads to some type of regional stability, it's not just about nuclear issue, it's on all these fronts. You know, one could say that, well, we have this difficulty with Iran and this history, this troubled history, and there was some talking about correct relationships. There might also be a way to look at understandings with Iran as a way to begin in regional affairs. Maybe there's one that can be negotiated in the context of helping bring an end to a terrible war in Syria, where so many people are paying a price every day it goes on. In Iraq, we have an understanding. The Iranian government supports Prime Minister Maliki. So do we. We may not be happy with how things are going with Iraq, with Maliki's authoritarian tendencies and some of the actions he's taken. But that does not mean that things would not be a lot worse for the United States, especially when we were withdrawing troops, if Iraq was an arena of conflict between the United States and Iran. But it isn't really. Iraq is suffering from terrorism because, again, of internal problems and also because of a war in Syria. Terrorist groups are also a threat to us and a threat to Iran. Another place where the U.S. and Iran have an understanding is Afghanistan. They support the government of Hamid Karzai. So do we. Doesn't mean we don't have problems with Karzai. But as the U.S. anticipates a troop withdrawal in Afghanistan, think about if Iran was on the other side. This is a tough neighborhood. These are challenging countries to deal with. The more understanding and contacts you have with the key players, the better it is. The trend in Syria, and so you could say, you know, well, Russia and Iran support Assad, and that's true. You don't make peace with your friends. And I used to have a colleague, a boss, who, when I was in the business world, would say, every conversation about business is a good conversation. Any conversation you have about ending the war is a good conversation, in my opinion. And those who want to frame Iran out, I interviewed Prince Turki Al Faisal the other day. They're all in, as they say, in Syria, even if it means a little distance from the United States, to support the opposition, the moderate opposition, who they feel have been slighted by the United States. They're there in part to challenge Iranian interests, and but every day that war goes on, more people are killed, and the consequences of not getting to Geneva, not doing anything you can, means that the war continues. There's really no other way. That's the trend. That's part of the Iranian trend in the region we're talking about. And there are other aspects of this trend. I mean, one other piece we followed closely at Al Monitor is Turkey. We'll see the foreign minister of Iran will be in Turkey next week to go there. Turkey also in Syria is under pressure. The border has become difficult because of refugees, because of radical Islamic groups on its border. Just a week and a half ago, Turkish forces engaged forces of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria on its border. People are starting to look at that. And even in Qatar, we've seen under the new emir a more openness to engagement with Iran and a more receptivity in terms of engagement on Syria. So these are some of the trends we've been looking at, that'll monitor, and looking at with regard to Iran, where the diplomatic opening or opportunity is not only in the nuclear front, but I think also connected to broader issues in the regional context, which are essential that we need to deal with, and that we need to deal with Iran in order to help end the war in Syria and bring some greater stability to all the countries and peoples there that are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parsley. I'm sorry. We are going to move on now to the panel discussion segment, and I will try to start the discussion by asking just 2 questions, and then we will open it up to audience questions as well. I'll ask the panelists to try to keep their answers brief in this section to about 2 minutes each. And the first question I'm going to ask is about sanctions. And in the interest of a lively discussion, I will ask the first question directed towards Dr. Clausen and then ask the rest of the panelists to respond to him. If you want to respond, just try to raise your hand gently and I will get your attention and moderate. So the first question, I want to kind of take the policy aspect purely of sanctions and take aside for a second the humanitarian aspect, which is certainly important, and ask the question, is there a causal link between the unilateral and multilateral sanctions and the election of Hassan Rouhani and this new tone or perhaps even a new strategy in Iranian foreign policy? So the essential question is, did sanctions work?
It's difficult to come up with an explanation as to why it is that in the Iranian presidential election, 6 of the 7 candidates criticized the previous nuclear negotiator, unless there was some impact that sanctions were having on the debate inside Iran. It's difficult to see why it is that Mr. Rouhani's focus on the economy would have been so successful unless the sanctions were having some impact on Iran's economy. It's difficult to see why it is that after several years in which Iran seemed entirely uninterested in a nuclear deal, that we have a new nuclear negotiating team that is obviously interested in reaching a deal as quickly as possible, unless the sanctions were having some impact on Iran. And I think one of the people whose opinion we should listen to in this matter is Mr. Rouhani, who says repeatedly that sanctions were having a dramatic impact on Iran and that a change in approach was necessary. So from the perspective of the Obama administration, and this frustrated many people who thought that sanctions must have some other purpose, as I have written in several monographs, the Obama team from the beginning always thought of the sanctions as being an instrument to use to get Iran to negotiations. So while the sanctions may not have accomplished some of the other purposes other people had in mind for them, they did accomplish Mr. Obama's purpose.
Would any of the other panelists like to jump in and respond to that question on the effectiveness of sanctions? Yes, please, Ambassador Miller.
I think Patrick is quite correct. The sanctions have helped, but we have to examine the logic of the sanctions. The logic of the sanctions was primarily to deal with the suspicion that Iran was producing nuclear weapons. If it is certified that Iran is not producing nuclear weapons, then the logic of the sanctions falls away. And we should both declare victory.
First, Mr. Rouhani, when he was running for president, he never talked about sanction having any impact. His basic point was mismanagement. And then after he became president, he started talking about sanctions. You have to understand that. It's very important. This politics in the country. Second, sanctions were not imposed to bring Iran to the negotiations table because they were negotiating. They have been negotiating for almost 10 years now. they were imposed to stop Iran from enriching at a higher level. But the fact is that as the sanctions grow, Iranian enrichment grow as well, centrifuges, grades, and so on. So sanction from that perspective is a failure. But did sanction harm the Iranian economy, hurt the Iranian people? Absolutely yes. But I tell you one thing, it is more than sanction, is the mismanagement of that economy that is harming, is hurting the Iranian people. For 34 years, that economy has been mismanaged, including the last 8 years that have been seriously mismanaged. So I think those of you who think only sanctions are responsible for what's happening to the Iranian economy and its people, please understand that also the mismanagement is a factor, and indeed, in my view, is a more important factor. So again, moving forward, if you add more sanctions in the hope that you get more out of Iran, it's going to be a mistake, because the centrifuge is going to go up and up. And that's the bottom line, as it has in the last 10 years. So yes, the sanctions have harmed, but they haven't really gained the basic purpose that for which they were imposed, to stop Iran and change Iran's behavior. Thank you.
Okay, I will move on to the next question. Actually, I'll direct the next question to Dr. Andrew Parasiliti, and we'll ask about Syria. So recently, Secretary of State John Kerry said that he doubts that Iran could play a constructive role in the Geneva II talks. Similarly, conversely, the UN and Arab League Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi said that Iran should play a constructive role. Where do you see Iran's role in the Geneva talks and the future of building, let's say, a stable Syria?
Well, what you said is correct, that the Secretary of State said specifically that Iran, he didn't think Iran could play a constructive role unless Iran accepts the Geneva Communique, which is the 2012 agreement from the previous, the action plan of the group that met then, which Iran was not a member of, neither was Saudi Arabia, to implement a political transition. And Iran may not accept the Geneva Communique. There is, the Iranian position is that there should be no conditions on Iranian participation in Geneva II or the Syrian process, and some may read the Geneva Communique and some of the language about the mutual consent and transitional government. I won't go into great detail here. We can after if you like, or you can read some things we write about this, as a condition regarding Assad's participation or not. The Iranian position, as I understand it, and as told to me by the foreign minister, is that they're ready to help on Geneva II. They're in touch with the Syrian government, some opposition groups. They believe that there's an interest in ending the war. They don't necessarily, as I can tell, support the Geneva Communique, but are still willing to play a role and will attend Geneva II if invited. Brahimi, as you mentioned, Ambassador Brahimi was just in Iran. He said, I forget the exact words he used, it's natural that Iran should participate. So there, and I read the comments by others. The Russians feel that Iran should participate. And the logic dictates that Iran should participate because of Iran's relationship with the Syrian government. And they're just, the reality of the process is there will not be an end to the conflict, the first order of business, if the Iranian government is not involved. So whether that's a formal seat at the table at Geneva II, I don't know, maybe, or some other role that Iran can play in the process, I think that's a possibility. But I think if one's interest is ending the war and the settlement to the war, then I think that dictates engagement with Iran on the resolution in Syria.
So Dr. Clausen will respond, and then Dr. Rouhani as well.
I see no prospect that the Geneva II will have any impact on stability in Syria, or any positive impact on stability in Syria. The major combatants will not be present. Those who are fighting against the Assad regime, who are actually fighting against the Assad regime, openly reject the process and have no respect whatsoever for those who are mooted as the potential people present. So I see little prospect that Assad will pay much attention to what happens at the Geneva II either. So the idea that we are going to end this civil war through negotiations at Geneva is quite unsupported by the facts on the ground. I'm not saying that it's something I would particularly like, but folks, the combatants aren't going to be there.
Iran's foreign policy runs in two levels. One I call the revolutionary level, controlled by Ayatollah Khamenei. And we should not forget that Iran still is a revolutionary country, has a revolutionary leader, has a revolutionary guard, and so on and so forth. And the second level is, of course, the pragmatic level that is run by the foreign ministry. Even under Ahmadinejad, the radical, the government was not in favor of supporting Bashar Assad. He, in fact, conflicted the Revolutionary Guard and Ayatollah Khamenei on that, saying that Assad's days are over, that we should not put our assets behind a person that is dying, politically speaking. But even then and today, and of course, Rouhani and Dr. Zarif have taken basically the same view. Their official position is that Assad is gone, that we are going to be thinking of a Syria beyond Assad, without Assad, but they are trying to protect the people who are with Assad, the Alawites and others. So then they want a coalition government of moderates, so-called. Now, that is very different from the position that the revolutionaries take. Ayatollah Khamenei and revolutionary leaders see Syria as a part of their what they call the strategic depth. The strategic depth meaning Syria with Hezbollah has basically been used as a wall to stop, to prevent Iran's regional enemies from coming in. So the more you can keep your enemies out by using Hezbollah and Iraq and Syria and Iraq and others, the better it is for Iran, because Iran knows that it cannot fight the U.S. inside its borders. And that's why Iran has decided over the last 30-some years that it fights its enemies beyond its borders, in Iraq, in Syria, in wherever it can. So Syria is Iran's strategic depth from a revolutionary perspective. And because of that, the solution to the Syria question, when Iran comes into this, is going to have to be very complicated, that there is a serious struggle within the country, what I'm trying to say, between the leader and Rouhani as to how to proceed. Rouhani and his people want to help create a coalition government. Khamenei, Revolutionary Guard, and his other peoples, revolutionary people, are not yet convinced. Thank you.
Ambassador Miller.
It only makes sense for all the parties in the region, particularly parties like Iran, to be involved in the outcome of what will happen to Syria. We know that it's been destroyed. The old form of Syria as envisaged by the post-World War I agreements has vanished, and a new Middle East in which Syria will be a part will have to be created. We look at the neighborhood, we see revolution in Egypt, possible revolutions elsewhere, and a fear of dramatic change. So it only makes sense for the parties to be able to exercise their positive qualities through diplomacy and humane assistance and decent behavior, and give peace a chance in a place that's terribly tormented.
I just want to make a quick comment in response to Patrick's comment. Geneva 2 is not synonymous with end of the war. Geneva 2 is an event about a diplomatic process to try to bring an end to the war. Absent a diplomatic process, or throwing in the towel, or staking your bet on that, we got to hang in there and keep the fight alive to level the playing field, means this war goes on, people keep getting killed, the humanitarian crisis continues, and as we've seen over the last 2.5 years, or more now, 3, Assad's not going anywhere right now. So the first order of business, especially when you have a grim report to the United Nations Security Council on Friday that you may have a polio outbreak in addition to another 120,000, whatever the official number of people killed, well, we can accept that this proxy war continues, or we can tell ourselves that Iran should not be invited because it doesn't accept the communique. Know the consequence of your action. The war goes on. The parties, I agree. The parties. This is a war. It's a hostile situation. And guess what? If the key stakeholders aren't there, of course it's going to go on. And even if the stakeholders come, it may go on. But you've got the United States, Russia, the United Nations, Iran saying, we're willing to see what we can do. You have a few other parties in the region who aren't interested in participating. So my point is a process point. Give it a shot. Throw your efforts behind it. Try to get everyone there and at least get the beginnings or the continuation of a petered out to this point diplomatic track to try to get it going again, because the catastrophe is
Andrew, you
great.
began your remarks by saying that it's important for us to have thoughtful analysis and not wishful thinking. Apply that to Geneva. The thoughtful analysis of the Syrian civil war is going to go on for more years, and many tens of thousands more people are going to die.
If there's no diplomatic process and you don't bring
whether or not there's a diplomatic process, that's going to happen, because the combatants are not going to stop just because of the diplomatic process. Like the great majority of civil wars in the last 100 years, this war will end when the fighting peters out on the ground. That is a bitter reality. And I think that is one of the reasons why President Obama has been so reluctant to get the United States involved. Now, I'm upset about that bitter reality, but as an analyst, I will tell you right now, there will be bitter fighting and ethnic slaughter in Syria for the next several years. Nothing can stop that. Nothing. Including, and on this one I would agree with President Obama, if the United States sent 500,000 troops, it would still be the case.
One must also see the opportunities for diplomacy that are before us. That may be a fair statement. I can't see the future. But what I do know is yours is a self-fulfilling outcome, because if you give up on diplomacy and you overlook the fact that the United States and Russia are now working together, and Russia has a relationship with the Syrian government, if you overlook the fact that the Iranian government has said it is willing to help, if you want to toss it all
But Andrew, you have never once said any reason why any combatant fighting the Syrian government should be interested in this process. You continue a litany of reasons why those who support the Assad government are interested in this process. You have never once indicated any reason why anybody opposed to the Assad government is going to be paying attention to what happens in Geneva. They won't. We have got a diplomatic process in which everybody agrees is going to be present in a room. Unfortunately, they're not the ones doing the fighting.
I think there are, again, if you watch what's happening in the region, you see a country like Turkey that's increasingly under pressure on its border because of this war. It's not a win for the Turkish government. It's no win for the Iraqi government with what's happening with the terrorism there. It's no win for Lebanon. It's no win for the people of Syria. And now you have the U.S. Iran. So you tell me who's invested in keeping it going. My point is, you got to pressure these parties to try to talk about
Al-Qaeda.
So I'm going to just briefly interject here. It's great that we have this lively debate. I think both the points of both speakers have been very adequately made. So I'm going to just ask Ambassador Miller to close off the Syria discussion, and then we will open it up to Q&A from the audience.
I think the possible role of diplomacy is to change the equation from killing by proxy or by direct involvement, and to look for a peaceful Syria. And that's not beyond our capabilities. We've had much bigger challenges in the past.
Great. Okay, we have a lot of people who want to ask questions. I saw his hand go up first. Please, this gentleman with the glasses. We have a microphone for audience questions as well. And please just introduce yourself and your title and your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin, a retired bureaucrat. Going back to Patrick Clausen's point about the fighting going on for several more years, the fighting will go on as long as both sides have arms. The opposition is being supplied right now by Saudi Arabia and a couple of others, and we know that Syria is getting its arms and support from Iran and the Russians and so on, and Hezbollah is helping. But if you can get the parties to agree not to supply each side, then the war could fairly quickly stop. And that's, I think, what is being suggested, as opposed to Patrick Clausen, yours view that the war will go on indefinitely. Does that make sense to you?
No, I cannot think of any civil war which stopped after an arms embargo. Name me one. That was not a civil war. And nor did it stop because of an arms embargo. It stopped because one side had lost on the battlefield. It's...
Wish we had him here.
Yes, wonderful.
I can't come up with an example, but I don't see a reason why that shouldn't take place.
If history were different and we were in a different planet, you're quite right.
Time will tell.
All right, we have a lot more questions. He's very eager as well. Please.
I appreciated everybody's contribution to the panel. All of you are eminent panelists, of course. But why was the U.S. original sin in Iran, the coup that overthrew Mossadegh in 1958, organized by the CIA, why was that not mentioned, number one? And number two, why are Israel's nuclear weapons taboo to discuss and put on the table as part of this whole thing? I mean, this is quite ridiculous, in my opinion, to avoid these two historic realities. Israel possesses between 200 and 300 nuclear-tipped MIRVs, which are capable of decimating any Middle Eastern city around it, okay? And they have not signed on with the NPT, with the IAEA, or any such thing, or inspection regimes, not at all. Okay, why we shouldn't be discussing Israel's weapons? Why is that taboo? And the issue of the original sin of the United States in Iran and in the Middle East, although it was responsible for another coup in Syria before the Mossadegh coup in '53, in Syria in '49. I mean, why we can't really focus on the impact, the terrific impact that had on bittering relations between Iranians and Americans?
If we want to discuss the sin of holding nuclear weapons, we should start by looking at ourselves. The United States has vastly more nuclear weapons than Israel. And if you think that it's inappropriate for any country in the world to have nuclear weapons, then we should be moving towards a world that's free of nuclear weapons. Having Iran with dangerous nuclear program is not helping that objective. As for the Israeli nuclear program, the stated position for 25 years of the Israeli government is they look forward to the day when the Middle East is a zone of peace, with all nations accepting the right of others to live in peaceful borders, at which point a discussion could begin of eliminating the weapons of mass destruction in in the Middle East. I think that the day in when the Iranian ambassador in Jerusalem and the Saudi ambassador in Jerusalem go to see the Israeli government to discuss eliminating Israel's nuclear weapons, agreement could be reached quickly.
Ambassador Miller had a response as well. So I'm going to ask audience members not to continue to jump in, but to have the panelists respond. So Ambassador Miller wanted to respond.
The coup organized by the CIA and the British to overthrow Mossadegh was a huge mistake, which whose consequences are evident today. And this is part of the litany of every discussion with the Iranian government. This is reviewed and commented upon, and understandably so. Madeleine Albright, as Secretary of State, dealt with that issue by saying that, in her view, it was a mistake. But we're living with the consequences now, and we understand that, and the Iranians understand it even better than we do. So that's part of the historical background, and we want to move on from that point to a recognition that there are better ways of dealing with our oil problems than overthrowing governments, and perhaps we've learned that lesson.
If another speaker wants to jump in, you may do so. Otherwise, I'll move on to another question. This woman over here.
Kevin, you can take a few questions and then.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Fariba Parsa. I'm a researcher at George Mason University Center for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I have a comment and a question to Dr. Patrick Clone. My comment is here this debate about the nuclear program. We never hear the voices of people, Iranian people, and why this topic why is it so taboo in Iran? Discussing if Rouhani is right, is a peaceful. Why is it? What is the effort to discuss, to let people discuss it? And my question is, could you explain a little more about correct relation? You mentioned relation between Iran and not about the U.S. and USSR. Yes, during Cold War, and it's quite different between Iran and U.S. What do you think about, for example, sanction? Is it how it is correct relationship should looks like? Thank you.
So let's do 2 or 3 questions quickly, and then the speakers can address all of them. So this gentleman here had a question as well, and then over there. We'll do those 3.
I would like to direct my comments towards Dr. Clausen on 2 issues. First one was you mentioned that you don't see Iran stopping its support of Hezbollah. If I remember correctly, it was in 2001 or 2002 that Iranian government was during President Khatami's administration, and over here President Bush, that sent a cover letter, which later became known as the Grand Bargain, which was rejected by the U.S. But one of the issues, one of the things that Iran was willing to do was the peaceful transition of Hezbollah from a armed force to a political party. So I think at some point that was on the table. So I would love to hear your comment on that. And then the other thing was the Supreme Leader's attitude towards the states and seeing the United States as some sort of attacking Iran in a cultural manner. I believe that that's what he says. I don't think that's what he believes, because I think during the past 20, 15 years there has been a huge cultural shift in the context of Iranian population. I'm happy to report that, because as someone who came to the States about 10 months ago, right now the Iranian youth population is awash with miniskirts, so that's good. Everything, yeah. Yeah, I'm a big fan. Anyway, and I think that he understands that, but he also has to maintain his image in the eyes of fundamentalists and conservatives, because that's something that that's been his platform, and he doesn't want to be seen as flip-flopping. So I guess, yeah, I would love to hear your comments on that.
Okay, and one more from the young lady here, and we'll deal with all of those questions.
Thank you. Really fast, I just wanted to ask the question on human rights in Iran and what the U.S. and international community can do to support that, and the role that the nuclear negotiations have on this process. Thanks.
Okay, so 4 questions on the table. The first one was about sanctions and correct relations. The second one was about Hezbollah and the grand bargain, whether Iran could transform Hezbollah. The third one was about the cultural invasion and whether or not that's a genuine concern on the part of the Supreme Leader. And the fourth was about human rights and what we can do about them. So why don't we try and start with the first one?
Yeah, correct relations between two governments means that the two governments are speaking to each other on a regular basis and exchanging information. But certainly during the Cold War, when the two sides had 30,000 nuclear weapons armed at each side, correct relations doesn't mean that there's normal, peaceful state. And I would assume that correct relations between the United States and Iran, I would hope that there could be correct relations between the United States and Iran, and much dialogue, even if sanctions were being maintained. By the way, there is much debate inside Iran about the nuclear program. We have a monograph on the subject coming out soon that refers to well over a dozen books and hundreds of articles about the debating this matter. If Iran can persuade Hezbollah to get out of the terrorism business, that'd be wonderful. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that certainly with the developments in Syria and Hezbollah's return to the international terrorism scene, with Hezbollah's agents have been found responsible by the courts in Cyprus and are being accused in Bulgaria and also in India, Azerbaijan, and Malaysia of planning terrorist attacks there. So if Iran can end that, that's wonderful.
Why don't we open this one?
Just very quickly about the Supreme Leader and the cultural invasion. Look, I think the Supreme Leader is quite right to fear the cultural invasion because it happened and he lost. And that is, I think, the greatest danger to the Islamic Republic. I mean, I think he's absolutely right. That is the real danger to the Islamic Republic lasting another generation. And I think he was correct in his evaluation, and the fact is he's lost. And that shapes a lot of his opinions and a lot of things that he does, is that he pretty well knows that he's lost the young people of Iran. And that I don't see a bright and shiny future for the Islamic Republic in Iran. I don't know. So far at least, it's led to an interesting process where most of the time it makes him much more bitter and decide to resist. But certainly the Rouhani election is a counterexample. But yeah, I think the Supreme Leader was right about the cultural invasion.
Do we want to open up the question about Hezbollah and the grand bargain to the panels? Any other panelists want to respond to that, whether or not Iran could transform Hezbollah and its relationship with Hezbollah?
Well, Hezbollah, as the majority party in Lebanon, has a political aspect which is dominant now, and presumably the war fighting with Israel will disappear when there's an Arab-Israeli settlement, or possibly a two-state solution, and the problems with Hamas and Hezbollah will fade into the background. That's the hope. And that should be the objective of diplomats and diplomacy and relations between countries. We should press that rather than the instruments of war.
And
just quickly, the 2 points on Hezbollah. First, I wanted to remind my friend, Dr. Clausen, that there was some years ago we used to call PLO a terrorist organization, and its leader, Yasser Arafat, was a terrorist. Years later, he became a freedom fighter and our friend, and because he changed his attitude. So again, people learn and things change. Transformation is possible. So if you think Hezbollah doesn't change or cannot change, I think you just have to look at the history, because you seem to believe in history and in experience. That's number one. And second, Iran's relation with Hezbollah has two sides to it. There is one, just an ideological relation, straightforward. Hezbollah is a Shia group. Iranian government is Shia. A lot of Iranian clerics that now govern the country have been in Lebanon. They have very close relationship with the leaders and people in that part of the world, in Lebanon. So there is that relationship. And the second relationship, as I said, is Hezbollah being a part of Iran's strategic depth. And in that part, I mean, Iran's relation, if was to change with the U.S. and with Israel and with other countries, I'm certain that Iran will not need anymore a Hezbollah to be its strategic depth, to provide that depth for it. So it can change. So again, Hezbollah I have to view Hezbollah in relation to Iran a little bit differently. And finally, I wanted to say this, and it's very important to remind us that 65% of the Iranian people are below 35 years of age. That is 35% of that population did not exist when the revolution happened. That's quite a massive number of people. I mean, we have to remind ourselves. And the first generation leaders of the Islamic republics are 60s plus. Some years from now, many of them will not be around. So think about generational change as well and give time a chance. Thank you.
So I know other speakers want to get in on this. I think in the interest of time, we will have to come to the last question, which is an important question. I'd love to get every speaker in. Would you mind if I move to the human rights question?
Yes.
Just in the interest of time. So the young lady asked about human rights in Iran and what can be done about it. I'll ask every speaker who'd like to address that question, and then I will pass it over to Manuela.
Yes.
Please, Ambassador Miller.
I think that's a pertinent question, measuring the quality of nations, and the experience of Iran that I'm aware of directly. When I served there were human rights abuses under the Shah of the most horrendous sort. There are horrendous abuses now that we're aware of. And the way out of this human condition is for exemplary leaders to show the way. And I would say that among the human rights cases that I've been directly involved with, the release of the hikers, the release of Haleh Esfandiari, the Iranian government demonstrated its best qualities by assisting in their release. So it's a matter of leadership, decency, the national values, religious values, all play a role. And we should try and create circumstances in which the best aspects of human nature can lead the way rather than the worst. And war is the worst. Continuing war and violence is the worst. Treating people with decency and respect is the best.
Does anyone else want to?
Look, I've written several publications on the theme that the United States government's focus of its activities in Iran should be the promotion of democracy and human rights rather than the nuclear accord, because arguing that who knows if the Iranian government will actually implement the nuclear accord on a sustained basis, but if there were a more democratic government in Iran, that we would have many fewer national security problems with Iran and a better relationship with Iran. That is not at all, the argument I made is not at all the position of this administration. And there is no possibility whatsoever that this administration would allow human rights objections or human rights violations to stand in the way of a potential nuclear accord. This President Obama's priority is very much achieving a nuclear accord.
I just wanted to say that first, obviously, the Iranian government does abuse the Iranian people's human rights. It's condemnable. We all have to condemn that. I think the Iranian government must stop that and protect their rights, and recognize that, and practically implement a plan that will lead to their human rights. But I also have to say this. Unfortunately, the problem in Iran is not just the human rights. I think it is even the citizenship rights, which are the very basic part of the human rights. The Iranian people don't have even sometimes their basic citizenship rights recognized. For example, in Iran, not everybody can become a president. That the government has to decide who should run, who should run for it. And I think that's not acceptable. It is not acceptable. I think citizenship rights is the basic rights of all Iranians before the human rights. And finally, I think it is extremely important to understand this part, that the problem of human rights or citizenship rights is the problem between the Iranian people and their government or system. I think the problem between the United States and Iran must be kept separate from that problem. The human rights should not be on the table for the Americans and Iranians to negotiate when they are talking about nuclear issue. But I believe Americans, because this is their value, they must continue talking about human rights in principle and demand that Iranian people recognize the Iranian people's citizenship rights as well as human rights broadly. Thank you.
So I know there is a class waiting to come in, so we'll just ask for some brief remarks, and then I will have Manuela close for us.
I think the issue of human rights was well represented here. The United States should never flinch from criticizing human rights or supporting human rights and democracy anywhere, including in Iran. If there is, and we cover that as well at Al Monitor, whether it's religious freedom or various aspects of what the regime does, it's condemnable. But I agree with Dr. Amir Ahmadi. When you're trying to do a nuclear deal or you're trying to end the war in Syria, I wouldn't put that messy issue on the table there at this time. But I do think that if there is a trend in a better relationship, even a correct relationship, if not a rapprochement, that the and people-to-people contacts and all these things continue, I think our hand is strengthened in engaging Iran on these issues of democracy and human rights. And the only final point, and it's a 15-second one, and again, I think the panelists all said it, on Hezbollah, and it's just to make another point, how the differences in how it's perceived as a political organization in Lebanon, preponderant political organization. The Lebanese political structure is a longtime ally of Iran, but also by the United States, as has been others in the European Union, as a border of terrorism, whether there's a potential for change or not. This takes you very quickly to the linkage between what's happening in the nuclear negotiations and what's happening in the region. And it's very much in our sanctions law. I mean, the president can waive certain things and do certain things by executive order, but when the day comes to get rid of the Iran Sanctions Act, you got to be talking about Hezbollah and its role in the region. Sure. And if you're talking about Syria, you're talking about Hezbollah. So the point is, engagement with Iran is essential to